Hi, and welcome again to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas, and today we're going to be doing a wrap-up of the CDFM Module 2.1, the Defense Budget Process. So in the wrap-up, that means I'm not going to be identifying the pages that I'm on. I'm going to sort of be telling the Module 2.1 like a story to try to help you now put everything together. And I'm just basically reading the story from the beginning and working my way through, pinpointing some of the key aspects of the 2.1 defense budget process. So what you first need to understand is that the National Security Act of 1947 was the law that established a couple of things. One, it established the Navy. It also established the National Security Council that we're going to talk about, the Secretary of Defense position and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and also the Joint Chief of Staff. So you had a Joint Chief of Staff for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and so forth. So each of those had a joint staff. But we do not have a chairman yet. So it's not until much later, and we're going to look at that when you get the chairman. So right now, the National Security Act of 1947 established the Navy, the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we know that the mission of the Department of Defense, the word defend, is responsible for providing the military forces necessary to deter war. We're not looking for war, but we need to be able to deter it, change it, get rid of it if possible, and also to provide security for our country. So we're going to be looking at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So that means in that office, there's a couple of key individuals responsible for specific functions dealing with the defense budget process. And so a couple that we're going to look at first is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. The acquisition in their title tells you that's the senior DoD person responsible for acquisition. So USD AT&L, Undersecretary of Defense, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. So to the right, you must remember USD AT&L is a couple of things. They're the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. They are also called the Defense Acquisition Executive, and they are the milestone decision authority for acquisition category 1 Delta. The D behind it means it's a defense level acquisition. The next subject matter expert in the Office of the Secretary of Defense is the USD for Policy. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is the one in charge of developing the Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR, and also responsible for the planning phase. Think of USD policy. That means they're the one responsible for writing the policies. So don't make it any difficult than it needs to be. So Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the QDR is that 4-year strategy document for the DoD. You got to generate it somewhere. So that's the policy guide. Policy guide is also responsible for the planning phase of the PPBE process. The other important one we're going to look at is the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. That's the Chief Financial Officer for the DoD, or the Secretary of Defense. The USD Comptroller is responsible for the budgeting and the execution phase of the P process, PPBE. Another one is the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DCAPE. The DCAPE is the one responsible for updating the Future Year Defense Program that we're going to look at. The DCAPE is also responsible for providing guidance. So the DCAPE is also responsible for giving us guidance on development of the alternative of the objectives, the AOA, the analysis of the alternatives in the cost and economic analysis section. So, but right now we're just going to focus on 2.1, but I have to be able to tie in some of the other topics we've talked about. So again, Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer responsible for the budgeting and execution phase of the PPBE. Now, moving along, we also look at a couple of other individuals. You have the Joint Staff, they're the military advisors. So Army, Navy, Air Force, there's a Joint Staff for each one of those that they provide guidance to the SecDef. And remember that now we've introduced, and now let's see, I think we talk about the Goldwater-Nichols Act that developed the position of the chairman. So you have Army Joint Staff, Navy Joint Staff, Air Force Joint Staff, and it's not until now we didn't have one single spokesperson for the Joint Staff advising. You have different advisors depending on the service. So later on, they decided, hey, let's establish a senior person, one chairman of the Joint Staff to be the spokesperson for that group collectively. So the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the senior military advisor. He has a vice chairman of the Joint Staff, and we talked about the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff being in charge of JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. The vice chairman of the Joint Staff also being vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, and also the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So same person sits on all of these boards, council in charge of the JCITS to make sure that everything is in line for meeting the National Defense Strategy in the QDR, and the QDR is responsible for meeting the National Security Strategy, that big op order. Another key player, the combatant commander. So remember, operational chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. However, communication from the SecDef goes through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Now you might say, well, why does the SecDef have to go through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? Because President is a civilian, Secretary of Defense is a civilian. Your top military advisor is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So it makes sense. If the top person in uniform is the chairman, then the chairman should be the one relaying the mission, relaying the message to the combatant commanders, because he knows how to speak their language. He knows how to give the strategy from the military perspective to meet that defense strategy. So if that makes sense. So we have civilian control of the military. So we talked about the 3 DoD support systems that overlap. If you remember that those 3 circle diagrams, how they overlap, you have JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. The purpose of the JCITS system is once we take that big national security strategy op order. So think of an op order. You have the NSS, the National Security Strategy. And who gives us the national security strategy document? Well, that comes from the National Security Council. And the next question I'll ask is, who makes up the National Security Council? The standing members are the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy and Water, 2 primary advisors, the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and the Director of Intelligence. And then you have some other statutory members. You have some other members that sit on the council, but those primary members and advisors are what make up the National Security Council. So the council, which is the top strategic organization in our country, they then determine what threat do we face in country, threat do we face overseas, how do we plan to attack, to deal with those threats? What strategy are we going to have? So that is called the National Security Strategy document. That's our big op order. And what do we do when we get an op order? We receive it from our higher command. We begin to read it. But the first thing we do is we look for our organization and see what applies to our organization. What do we have to do in this big op order called the National Security Strategy to be able to accomplish what needs to be done? So the National Security Council develops the National Security Strategy, and then you have the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff that comes in and evaluates what the military portion is. So the SecDef is responsible for analyzing the defense-related items in the big op order and develop defense strategy. But within that, your top military advisors to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the chairman develops the national military strategy. He is the author, the executor of the national military strategy. So it's like having a subject matter expert. That's what the chairman is, your SME on the military. So he writes the military strategy, gives it to the SecDef. The SecDef takes all the input from all of the subordinate offices, policy, take direction from the USD, AT&L, all those guys. The chairman gives them the national military strategy, and then the SecDef develops the Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR. And I already mentioned earlier who is responsible for starting the QDR process. That is the USD for policy. So the 3 DoD support system, JCIDS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. So JCIDS, what they do, based on what the defense strategy is, what things we need to accomplish, now the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System is used to analyze the current capability. What current capability do we have? What capability do we need to accomplish this strategy? And then they determine what capability gap. So what's in between there? I know what I have. I know what I want to do. What capability gap are we missing to accomplish this strategy? So I mentioned that we look at the .MLPF. You look at doctrine, you look at the organizational structure, you look at training, you look at personnel. You also look at material, which is like equipment. So all the JCIDS, who is the responsibility of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, they're doing the JCIDS process to determine, do we have a doctrine problem, training, organization, personnel, or material? Do we need a new truck? Do we need a new aircraft? That's a material. So if the result is a material solution, then that triggers the acquisition system. If it's a doctrine, that is simply we need to enter the PPBE process to get the programs authorized, to get funding to be able to satisfy that capability gap. So JCIDS develops capability gaps. The Future Year Defense Program, that's the DoD database that keeps track of all the forces, resources, equipment, personnel necessary to get a mission accomplished. And I also stated in the beginning that the FYDP update is the responsibility of the Director of CAPE, DCAPE. So every time you update funding, update the programs, update the resources, he has to consistently update the FYDP, FYDP, Future Year Defense Program. And so the planning phase, so let's say now we've left JCIDS, we're going into the planning phase of PEEP. So in the planning phase, there's a few guidance. Now we're taking that DoD strategy and we're putting a plan in place. How are we going to accomplish this? In the planning phase, we're trying to identify that. So we look at the defense planning and programming guidance. And that's, you see, is going to be that final planning document in that PPBE planning phase. So DPPG is the final DoD document published in the planning phase of PEEP. The plan is putting that strategy into action. This is our plan, how we're going to accomplish our strategy. So that's the process. Using all the guidance, quadrennial review, we talk about the joint strategic planning, we talked about Homeland Security, all of those, national military strategy, and the national military strategy document is developed by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And communication from the president, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders goes through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And if you go back to the hierarchy chart, you'll see that dotted line that goes from the chairman down to those combatant commanders. So we said operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense directly to the combatant commanders. So how does the combatant commanders tell the DoD through the chairman what type of issues, what's their shortfall? If they're in charge of Northcom, Southcom, wherever, AFRICOM, and they have some issues, shortage of personnel, shortage of equipment, how do they notify these key individuals? That is done, so combatant commanders issue an integrated priority list. So it's like that critical commanders list of things that we need, or I need if I'm in charge of Northcom. These are the integrated priority list. That is, a copy is sent to the SecDef, a copy is sent to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, top military advisor, and a copy is also sent to the military department that's going to be responsible for providing these resources. So it's either, if it's an Army asset, then a copy is going to the Army, just to give them a heads up of what's needed and what's being sent forward. So combatant commanders write IPLs, integrated priority list. The next phase of PEEP is the programming phase. And who's in charge of the programming phase of PEEP? So we said the planning phase, who was in charge? The USD for policy, Undersecretary of Defense for policy, responsible for the planning phase, responsible for development of the QDR. The programming phase is the responsibility of the Director of CAPE. So before you begin the programming phase and the budgeting phase, both the Director of CAPE and the USD Comptroller will issue an integrated program and budget guidance. So just remember, anytime before we start a phase or a process, we have to receive guidance from higher. And so that's what it is. So the POM, the Program Objective Memorandum, the DoD components develop proposed programs consistent with the DPPG. So based on the guidance we receive, again, everything is in line for meeting the National Defense Strategy, and the National Defense Strategy is in line to meeting that big op order called the National Security Strategy. So at the end of the planning phase, on your exam, you may see the word Defense Planning Guidance or Defense Planning and Programming Guidance, DPPG. It's the same thing. Guidance received before development of the programming and the budgeting phase. Once you send your POMs, programming documents, to the DoD, we looked at different boards that meet to discuss. If they have issues they cannot resolve at their level, they publish an issue book. An issue book is simply, if you could think of a commander's summary, is you have all these issues. Well, the commander the SecDef don't want to go through all of that to figure out what the issue is. So the issue book, you can look at it as a one-pager that says, this is the packet, and these are the issues that we have, why we cannot approve at our level, and we need your guidance to process. So the final document in the programming phase of PEEB is the Resource Management Decision. That's the DoD saying, this is what I am approving, this is what I'm sending forward to my hire. And who is the hire for the SecDef? The hire for in the resource management arena, the USD Comptroller hire is the Office of Management and Budget. Again, we're talking about budget. So you need to know that hierarchy, that chain of command. So because this is a DoD exam, we're not going to be talking about ASA, FMNC. We're not talking about Navy level, Air Force level. We're talking about defense level and higher, up to OMB, up to Congress, Congressional Budget Office. And remember, anything that comes from the military that gets sent from the combatant commanders that gets sent to the SecDef also gets sent to the chairman, top military guy in uniform. So the chairman can do an assessment, making sure, does this make sense? Is it military strategy make sense to still meet the commander's intent? So commander's assessment, then he gives a recommendation on what we submit. So in the programming phase, the responsibility of DCAPE, the final document in the programming phase is the Resource Management Decision. And remember, all these steps as we are progressing, when we complete the process, the RMD numbers are then also updated in the future year defense program. The third phase of PEEB is the budgeting phase. So now we take the plan, we put it into programs, allocation of programs, we prioritize which program that we want to accomplish, and then we need the budgeting phase. Now we need money. You can be authorized programs all day long, but the budgeting portion of the PEEB is what grants us budget authority, gives us the money to do it. So you can think of the PEEB process like, let's say you're planning a wedding. So your strategy is, we have a wedding we need to accomplish. You put the plan in place. Program is then determining the categories. I need to pay for a church. I need the reception hall. I need to pay for a photographer. Those are all your programs. The honeymoon, the limo, whatever. So all those categories are your programs. Although you can have a long list of programs of things you want to do you have the money to do it? So the next step is the budgeting phase. You need to determine how much money do I have available to match up to these programs, these categories. Am I going to be able to accomplish all the tasks, all the programs on my list, or am I going to have to cut some, reprioritize based on funding? So the budgeting phase at the DoD is the responsibility of the USD Comptroller. He's responsible for budgeting and execution. The budget estimate submission is the budget document that is sent forward for approval. And so you know the DoD's budget is going to eventually have to go to the OMB for inclusion in the president's budget. So OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, and the Office of Management and Budget, during the fall review, they get together and they go through the budget together to review it to see what is going to be in the DoD's budget. And once that budget review is completed and the SecDef is satisfied, if there are no issues, of course you got to do issue resolution. If there are issues with the budget, you got to settle all of that. And also, there's another system introduced in the budgeting phase. It's the Comptroller Information System. So on the budget side, just like we have GFIPS, we have our own system that we need to update. So you have the Future Year Defense Program database that's updated in every phase. And then in the budgeting phase, the additional system is a Comptroller Information System. That's where they keep track, the automated system to keep track of the budget numbers. And so once the issue resolution has been completed and we're satisfied, then the final document published in the budgeting phase of PEB is also called the Resource Management Decision. So to make sure you understand the program phase and the budgeting phase, because we ask for budget every year, the programming phase can actually take up to, 5, 6, 7 years of data. So that process is continuously going, and so they overlap with the budget, and then that final document they time out together is the Resource Management Decision. So let's recap. We have the Defense Acquisition Board, which is part of the acquisition system, and the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board is the Undersecretary of Defense, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. The USD AT&L is the chairman. He also has a vice chairman that sits on the Defense Acquisition Board, and that co-chairman or vice chairman is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, also sits on that board. So the acquisition board is the one that looks at all the DoD acquisition projects to ensure that the money is being spent in the right categories, right programs to meet the defense strategy. So part of that, remember the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, that JCID system, the three systems, JCIDS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. So you notice on the Defense Acquisition Board, you have the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who's Vice Chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, and Chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC. So the JROC is that council, that board that conducts the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, JCID. So if you just remember those three circles and how they overlap, and the same individuals that's part of one process is the vice chairman is part of the other system. all making sure that they're not just churning out on their own, because all three of those systems combine to provide the information that's listed in the defense strategy, which is the QDR. So what we talked about is the integrated priority list, which is the document we receive from combatant commanders. The combatant commanders submit the IPLs to the SecDef, to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and to the military department, giving them a heads up. We talked about the final planning document. So the planning phase of PEEB is the responsibility of the USD for Policy, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The USD for Policy is also responsible for updating and generating the QDR, Quadrennial Review. And so the final document in the planning phase is the Defense Planning Guidance, or it may be called the Defense Planning and Programming Guidance. In the programming phase, the Director of CAPE is in charge of programming. But before the programming phase begins, we get an integrated program and budget guidance. That means it's a combination of DCAPE giving us programming guidance and the USD Comptroller giving us budget guidance. So the integrated program budget guidance before we start the programming phase and the budget phase. So the POM, Program Objective Memorandum, whenever you hear program, that means programming phase. And we do the POM process. So in the programming phase, the final document is the resource management decisions. But in that meantime, if there are issues in the POM that we submit and those DoD boards cannot resolve the issues, that one-page narrative, that commander's summary document is called an issue page or issue narrative, is then published and prepared for the OSD staff to help make a decision. The final document in the programming phase, the RMD. The budgeting phase overlaps with the program. They happen at the same time, concurrently. And so the budgeting phase is the responsibility of the Chief Financial Officer for the DoD, which is the USD Comptroller. USD Comptroller is responsible for the budgeting and the execution phase of the PPBE process. So in the budgeting phase, you have the budget estimate submission, the BESS. So the services submit their budget, it goes through the different parts of Congress, and then the final DoD document that's published to say this is the budget that we're sending forward is also published in an RMD, Resource Management Decision. And so understand that the DoD database that keep track of all of these changes, updates, resources, equipment, and so forth is the Future Year Defense Program. When you get to the budgeting phase, an additional system used is the Comptroller Information System. That is a system that is used to keep the up-to-date information of the budget estimate. And once the DoD publishes the RMD, that is the DoD budget and programs that are submitted to Office of Management and Budget for inclusion in the President's budget, which is ultimately why we go through the defense budget process. So when we talk about the President's budget, we says the President's budget or the federal budget is required to be submitted to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. Regardless of what actually happens, what does textbook say is supposed to happen? No later than the first Monday in February. So the president completes the budget, and now the budget needs to go to Congress for Congress to approve that budget. So when it comes to the execution phase, before we get to what Congress does, is remember your appropriations, their life cycles, and such as MILPERS, O&M, which one's annual, which one is research is a 2-year, procurement 3 years, MILCON and ship conversion Navy, SCN, are both 5-year appropriation. So if it said what law requires the president to submit the budget no later than the first Monday in February, well, that was the 1974 Congressional Budget Act. So remember that also. So DoD appropriation includes MILPERS, O&M, RDT&E procurement, shipbuilding and conversion Navy, and military construction. So there's 6 different types of appropriation we deal with. And then I said, make sure you know, okay, your annual appropriation, MILPERS and O&M are 1-year expense type account. RDT&E is an investment. Procurement, ship conversion, Navy, and military construction are your investment type appropriation. Procurement, 3 years. MILCON, SCN, 5-year appropriation, because that's coming to will be very important later on. So you'll have annual funding policy, incremental. So your annual is your MILPERS and O&M. Incremental funding is your research, RDT&E. Your full funding are your procurement and MILCON. Because full funding means I have to pay to procure a fully functional end item. So I use full funding authority to do that. And sometimes you have advanced procurement because you have a long lead time before you can get to the actual usable end item. Multi-year appropriation, meaning that they're longer than 1 year. So like RDT&Es are multi-year, you'll hear that term, and so forth. And so you also want to look at the appropriation life cycle, which is what I discussed. When those funds are available for new obligations, they're current. But what happens when those funds expire? How long are they expired? All funds, all appropriations stay in the expired state for 5 years. And so you may be given an example. Okay, I have RDT&E funds. Today is, what's today's date? Okay, today is 4 February 2000 and whatever. So if it's 4 February, that means you're in the current FY. So let's say we're in FY 18. And it says I have RDT&E funds. So RDT&E funds are good for new obligation for FY 18, FY 19. Then it says it's expired for 5 more years. So 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So FY 24 is the last year in which those funds are in the expired state. So what can we do with funds when they're in the expired state? We can only make adjustments, upward or downward, but we cannot create any new obligations when the funds are in the expired state. And then once they're closed, we no longer have budget authority for those funds. However, the closed state says also that I have 1% of my current appropriation that I can use to pay off an old bill that falls in that closed state. So some of our obligating documents are contracts and military interdepartmental purchase requests, commonly known as the MIPR. And a MIPR can either be a project order or an Economy Act order. Project orders are those functions or job that stays within the Department of Defense. The key with the project order, if it's within a DoD agency, you do not have to deobligate the funds at the end of the fiscal year. The difference with the Economy Act order is it's intra-government, so it's a little bit wider. If you go outside of the Department of Defense to an intra-government agency, then at the end of the fiscal year, you are required to close out, to de-obligate the remaining funds on that MIPR. So make sure you know the difference between a project order and an Economy Act order. Contingent liability when it comes to contract. Usually it's written in a contract on what things need to be done and who's the contracting representative, who's going to be the government representative to sign off on that contract. Sometimes contractors do not perform according to standard. So the KO or contracting officer can cancel that contract for contractor default. And the rule behind that contractor default is you have to pay the contractor for the work, whatever the value is for the work that they did do, and then the remaining funds are used to get a new contract to complete that process. You have to stay within the scope of what was already approved. You have to stay within the dollar threshold of what was already approved. Remember the concept of the working capital fund? Working capital fund meaning that agency takes their funding to buy the product. Commissary takes the money, buy the goods, the food, put the food item on the shelf. The customer comes in, takes the food item, pays the commissary for the food item, then the commissary revolves, takes that money and keeps restocking. The idea behind the working capital fund, those are the X funds that do not expire. They still have restriction because as you read, you should remember how the working capital fund works or operates, that their overall goal is to break even. So they have to change their prices annually, whether it's upward or downward, to guesstimate, to estimate, to make sure that they do not consistently appear to be making a profit. So kind of make sure you get the understanding of the working capital fund. When you get refunds, it talks about what needs to be done. When you receive those funds, funding goes to the miscellaneous receipts account in the Treasury. So, for instance, if you have a soldier who lost military gear and they have to pay for it, that organization that lost that item in their inventory will not get the funding. So, unfortunately, when the soldier pays for that helmet, that gear that they lost, that fund is turned into the Treasury, into the miscellaneous receipt, because we cannot hold the funds. A few terms you need to be familiar with. Apportionment. So the floor fund is like this. So when Congress appropriates the money, we get an appropriation. That appropriation then has to be apportioned by OMB, Office of Management and Budget. Then DOD will issue allotments to the rest of us, and we commit, obligate, and then the funds are outlaid. So instead of disbursement, when it comes to this exam, the word outlay is what will come up. When the funds are removed from the Treasury to pay a bill, it is called outlay. So what happens when the president submits the budget to Congress? Well, Congress first has the Congressional Budget Office, their own budget office that they gather all the revenues for the prior year, the expenses, they provide our deficit, like a starting point for Congress, and then Congress, the House and the Senate will do a concurrent budget resolution. What that process is they're trying to determine what stipulation, what guidelines are we going to use to judge the president and the federal budget when it comes across our table. So they've already settled on what categories they're looking for. So the budget process when it hits the Congress is once they get the data from the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is to the concurrent budget resolution. And the second step is the authorization process. The authorization process, the purpose of that, which is handled by the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, is responsible for approving the program. So remember my example. So the authorization, so the concurrent budget resolution happens with the House and Senate Budget Committee. They decide on what the stipulations and guidelines they're going to use. The second part of the budget process at Congress is the authorization process. The House and Armed Services Committee of both the House and the Senate is the one responsible for the authorization process. So although dollar amounts are associated with the authorization law, we do not get budget authority in the authorization process. They're only authorizing the categories. So remember the wedding, we're planning the wedding. Program is we come up with the categories of programs we want to do for the wedding, and then budgeting, we want to know how much money do we actually get? How much money do we actually have? So the final phase when Congress gets the money is the phase that where most of us are in now for the FY18 budget, is the appropriation process, which is handled by the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. We want to know how much budget authority we have. We only get, that's the reason why the government shuts down if we don't have appropriation law. Because if you go back to Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, Article 1 tells you we're talking to Congress. Section 9, it says no money will be drawn out of the Treasury. We can't get no money out of the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law. So you get your budget authority from the appropriation law. And that's what we're always, so when you get a CR, that's dealing with the appropriation, continuing resolution, until you finally get a budget. The government shuts down because the law says you cannot draw money out the Treasury without an approved budget or appropriation law. So a couple of terms. So when it comes to the flow of funds, when Congress appropriates the money now and says, all right, now we are submitting, House and the Senate agree on a budget. Now we are approving one document to send to the president. But what happens when the House and the Senate cannot agree on what that one document looks like? They have to then come together in what's called a conference committee. So the House and Senate have their individual committees that meet, then they vote on what needs to be sent forward. The Senate has the same subcommittees. But eventually, when they do not produce the identical bill, they have to come together in a conference committee. So regardless if the House brings 10 members and the Senate brings 2 members, no one has the majority. They have to vote on whatever differences they have, and they're speaking for the House. So those 10 people have to speak for the one House, and that 2 individuals speak for the Senate. Because in the end result, when they walk away, they have to walk away with one document identical to send to the president for the president to sign for it to become law. So once let's say we do have an appropriation, the process is like this, flow of funds. So remember this throughout this whole process. Congress appropriates the funds. 2 things happen. The Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. Remember, law says I need this appropriation law, get money out the Treasury. So once the law has been passed for appropriation, the Treasury can now issue Treasury warrants. That's notice to us to say, hey, we got the law, we've been notified, your account's been set up. On the other side, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, begins the apportionment process, the SF-132 process. Apportionment is simply to each of the agencies, Department of State, Department of Education, Department of Defense, whatever funding they're supposed to get, OMB begins the apportionment process. These terms are important because part of the Module 2, they're going to ask you to calculate the unapportioned appropriation. So you need to know which one comes first. So it's appropriation, apportionment, allotment, commit, obligate, outlay. That is the order you need to understand. Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD and the other agencies issues allotment to their subordinates, and the rest of us commit, obligate, and outlay, disperse, take the funds out the treasury to pay the bill. So even if you get an exercise and it say, what's the unallotted amount? You have to first know if it's unallotted, that means I need to subtract what's already been allotted. And what's the step that comes before allotment? The apportionment process. So if I have anything apportioned minus allotment, will tell me what's been unallotted. So that's also part of 2.1. Then the final section in 2.1 is the NAF fund, non-appropriated funds. You have three categories. Category A, meaning you get 100% appropriated funds to do that, and no NAF funds. And you can read that part with MWR on the installation. Category B gets 65% appropriated money and 35% non-appropriate. That means they have to earn money from being on that installation. And category C, your fishing, your hunting, those are 100% NAF funds. That's how they generate their revenue, is by charging you a fee to go hunting, charging you a fee to fish. Those are typically category C type non-appropriated funds categories. All right, so this will conclude our wrap up for CDFM Module 2.1, the Defense Budget Process.